Welcome to Tekin Builds. It is great to see you all again, and for those of you just joining us, this is a show where we build RC cars from start to finish. My name is Ty Campbell, and this week we are going to start a brand new build from Tekno RC. It is the EB410.2 10-scale four-wheel drive electric buggy kit. Now this car has a lot of changes off of the original 410 release. Some of the most notable are the new revised chassis, the new forward position on the shocks and different rear arms, adjustable rear hub carriers, new 3.5mm HD hinge pins, along with new hinge pin braces. They changed some stuff in those 13mm big bore shocks. There's a new reverse bell crank steering system, so all of these improvements on the EB410 are just going to equal a better, faster, more reliable off-road vehicle. We're going to start by putting our kit together today, and then we're going to move right into installing some electronics in this bad boy. We're going to go with the Tekin RSX PRO. This is our 110 scale flagship modified racing ESC. We're going to put a new Gen 4 6.5 turn motor in here, and we'll cover some details on that new Gen 4 here in a bit. We're also going to install a Tekin steering servo to finish off the Tekin electronic trifecta in this buggy. I've also got some parts from Factory RC that we're going to install, a bunch of carbon goodies, including shock towers, some braces, and the battery brace. So let's check out what's in our box, give our user manual a quick glance over. We'll get our tools out, and then we'll start putting this guy together. Let's dig into this kit. It's a buggy. Alright, looks like we got all of our kit fluids, some thread lock grease, a couple diff fluids, and some shock fluids. Wing, body, and a bag full of bags, and another bag full of bags. Just our chassis plate. Yeah. And our user manual, body stickers, window masks. So that is everything that's in here. There are no wheels, but I'm going to show you which wheels I'm going to use on this kit when we get to mounting up our wheels and tires. So first part of our build is bag A, and it is our center differential. After that, looks like it is the front and rear differentials. So let's get all three of these put together. So if you've ever built 8-scale diffs before, these are exactly the same. They're just a little bit smaller because they're going in our 10 scale, and this car really is like a small 8-scale buggy with the 3 fluid-filled diffs. I like to lay all my parts out so that I know exactly where everything is. The first thing we're gonna do is grease up the grooves on these out drives, because these are gonna spin high RPM inside of our diff housing, and they need that lubrication on the O-ring so that you don't burn anything up and have diff fluid come pouring out all over the place. So we'll grease up the O-ring also, put that into our diff housing, and then put the washer down inside the housing as well. And then we're going to slide that out drive through both of them and then install the cross pin. Once the cross pin is in, we can drop our sun gear down in there and make sure it seats completely. We're also going to repeat the grease process on the spur gear side of the diff, greasing up that O-ring, installing the out drive, putting the washer on, cross pin, and the sun gear. Now all that's left to do is put our spider gears on our cross shafts. We'll drop that down into our housing, make sure that it seats down in there and nothing's binding. Give it a little spin. Then we can fill up our diff fluid, and we're gonna put 30K in this center. That's what the kit calls for. We're just gonna start there. Make sure you don't overfill it. You want the level just above the spider gears, and then we'll put the seal on, and then put the diff halves together, line up the holes, and then you can install the 4 screws to hold the spur gear. I like to use a driver to get them most of the way in, and then tighten them by hand because you don't want to strip these out. So that is our center diff. All 3 of these diffs go together exactly the same, the only difference being this one has the spur gear. The other 2 are gonna have the ring gear that goes inside the diff housing. that the pinion gear will interface with. I went with 30K oil. That is what the kit called for. We're gonna put the 10,000 and 15,000 in the front and rear differentials because I'm actually building this car for the Prez, and I don't know what kind of setup he's gonna like or what kind of track we're gonna be on when we get to racing, but we're just gonna set it up to kit so at least we have a baseline to start from. Now our front and rear diffs are gonna go together exactly like our center diff, the only difference being that there's a ring gear instead of the spur gear. So we're gonna go through that same assembly process, making sure we grease all those O-rings, get our spider gears and everything seated properly. We're gonna fill the front with 15,000 fluid and the rear with 10,000. Again, these are kit oils. Same oil fill procedure as the center diff, and then we'll pop both of these guys together and our diffs are done. The last thing I do when I fill these is I mark them with silver Sharpie, that way I know what fluid is in each diff. Well, that's our front and rear differential assemblies. These are identical other than the fluid that is inside them. We've got 10,000 in one, 15,000 in the other, and they are marked with silver Sharpie on the outside so that we remember what it is when we want to change it next. Now we're going to move on to our front and rear bulkhead assemblies. So the bulkheads of our car are essentially the diff cases, and everything is attached to these. We're gonna assemble our front and rear bulkheads, which turn into the front and rear clips, which includes all of our suspension linkages and arms and all that good stuff to go on our chassis. So the first thing we're gonna do is put our steering rack together. We're gonna make sure that we get the recommended amount of washers under each ball stud, just so that all of our geometry is correct as per the manual. We always want to Loctite into aluminum. That keeps things from coming apart. You definitely don't want your steering falling apart. Now we can focus on our diff case. We're going to install the bearings and the pinion shaft. The outdrive goes on the exterior of the pinion shaft. We're going to put a good amount of Loctite in there because, again, we don't want this coming loose. You'll lose front drive and that'd be a bummer. Next up, we install the steering rack onto the diff housing. You'll want to pre-tap these holes for the steering pin posts. That way they go in straight. Now we can put our front differential with 15K fluid in it. We want to grease those gears up nice and good. Make sure that everything is nice and free and that the gears spin well with each other. We'll put that front diff case on and screw it down, and then we'll also put the access hatch underneath for checking our gears and our grease. The rear bulkhead is exactly the same process. We're just gonna run through it real quick, getting everything attached, greasing up our gears again. We're gonna put our 10,000 weight-filled diff in the rear. We also need our sway bar mount to go on top of the diff case. And the rear also has an inspection port underneath. And that's it, both bulkheads are complete. Now we can move on to our rear bulkhead. I like to X-Acto the flashing off the arms to get rid of that so it looks professional. Then we're going to want to move on to our rear sway bar assembly, and popping those ball ends into the sway bar end links is kind of tricky. Thankfully Tekno has this really sweet shock tool that is a really nice multi-tool and has a whole bunch of little options on it for holding different things and popping different balls in and out. So make sure you grab one of these. It's going to make life a whole lot easier with assembly. So once we get the sway bar end links assembled, we can put them on our rear sway bar. Again, we want to Loctite the grub screws that go into these because you don't want your sway bar end links coming off out on the track. Now we'll want to install our grub screws for the droop in our arms. Make sure you do that before you put them on. Now we can put the pills in the C block. And these are adjustable pills, they're replaceable. You can flip them, turn them. There's a couple different ones in the kit for changing your anti-squat and your toe settings. And then we'll put the D block on last and screw it down. Last part is attaching our sway bar end links. Make sure the suspension is nice and free, you don't want anything binding. And continuing on with our rear bulkhead, we're going to assemble our CV shafts. These are the axles that transfer the power from your differentials out to your wheels. So you want to make sure to give these a good coating of grease. And you're going to want to service them often. You get dirt and stuff in there, they will wear out prematurely. Next, we're going to slide it through the hub with our bearings in place, put the axle pin through, and tighten the grub screw on our hex. Now these hubs are really cool. They are adjustable roll center, so there's different pills that go in the bottom to change the height, so you can change the roll center of your car fairly easily. And there's also inserts up top for our ball studs, so you can make little changes to the height. So now that we've got one whole rear hub and shaft assembly ready to go, we're gonna go ahead and put it into our arm. Make sure you get the little spacers in their proper orientation, but this is an adjustment that you can play with to change the way your car is gonna handle. Now this is where we're gonna put our first factory RC carbon option part on this car, and this is the rear shock tower in red weave carbon for the EB410.2, and it's 5 millimeters thick. So this thing's gonna be super stout, and it's gonna add a little bit of style to our rig. So now we can put our shock tower in place, followed by our camber link plate. We're gonna screw all of this together. 2 of these mounts actually hold the wing on, and the other 2 are going to screw into the rear body mount, so it kind of sandwiches everything together. Now we're gonna assemble our camber links. I like to put some grease on these. Chapstick works as well, and then we're gonna use our Tekno shock tool to hold them and twist them on. We wanna get the length close. It's probably not gonna be perfect, but we can adjust it once we've got wheels and tires on the car later. So now with our camber links assembled, we can go ahead and pop them on. And that is basically our finished rear end. Suspension's moving nice and free. So now we can move on to the front gearbox. Same process, we're gonna start with our sway bar, and then we're gonna put the pills in our A and B blocks, install those onto our diff case. Want to put our hinge pins in. These are the 3.5 millimeter HD hinge pins. We can slide our arms on, get our spacers on, and then we'll put that A block on and tighten the screws not all the way down. We want to leave them a little bit loose because this keys onto the chassis, and I'll show you that here in a bit. Then we want to attach our sway bar end links. Again, making sure suspension's free. And don't forget the grub screws, Campbell. Now we're going to install our front CV shafts, so same process as the rears. We're going to grease them up good, slide them through our spindles. Make sure we get that washer on there. Axle pin. And then our wheel hex. You also don't want to forget this steering stop screw. This changes the amount of steering throw your car can have. Kit setting is no washers, just the screw. Now we can install the spindle into our LRC spindle carrier. We want to line up the holes for the kingpins and then thread those in by hand. You don't want these too tight because it'll bind. Make sure everything's nice and free. Same process on the other side. With both of them built, we're going to install them onto our arms. So we'll line these up and get our outer hinge pin through the whole assembly, and then use the small retainer screw to hold it in. Now we can install all of our ball studs on our spindles and our hubs. Get our steering links popped on. Now we're gonna put our ball studs in our factory RC carbon camber link mount, get our shock tower on, then our link mount, and run the screws in. Now we can pop our camber links on. And last part is our shock standoffs in the shock tower itself. And that's a finished front end. Well, that is it. We've got both our rear clip and our front clip fully assembled, other than our shocks, which we're gonna cover here in a little bit. Now that these are completely assembled, we can go ahead and start putting our main chassis together, get these guys bolted on, get our center diff, all of our braces and all that stuff in, and then we'll get into doing our shocks. Now we get to really start bringing this car together. We've got our chassis plate right here. We're gonna start with our front clip, and this key's on. This is why we left those A-block screws a little bit loose, because they actually kind of clamp onto the front of the chassis. So once we get it seated, we can tighten the A-block screws down, and that'll clamp the front clip onto the front of the chassis. Get our front bumper on. You wanna Loctite these screws and then just tighten them by hand. Now we can install our center brace. This is the start of the backbone of the chassis. Now our motor mount, you definitely want to Loctite all of these. The motor mount's aluminum. These come out of the bottom of the car while it's running. It's gonna make it do some goofy stuff out on the track. Now the other half of our center diff mount can go in. It is plastic. Now we can put the bearings and the retainers on our center diff, get our front drive shaft lined up, and drop this whole thing into its spot. It's a little bit tricky, might take a little wiggling and getting the outdrive to line up, but then it'll slide right in. Then we can put another one of our factory RC top braces on, the right way, Campbell. There we go. This also has an integrated fan mount, so you can put a fan over the top of your motor. And now we can put our rear clip with our chassis brace installed and our rear drive shaft on. Get everything lined up and then just run all the screws in from underneath. The last brace is our front top kick plate brace. This holds the top of our steering rack and then attaches to our center backbone brace. Now we can drop our servo mount on, and then the mud guard on the opposite side. This thing's really coming along nice. And the last little bit is our factory RC carbon battery strap. Man, this thing looks really good. So we're really close to having a running car. All that's left now is to build our shocks. We're gonna go ahead and throw those together real quick, get this thing basically wrapped up and ready to install our electronics. So let's get those shocks put together and finish this guy. We're in the home stretch of our buggy build now. The last part is our shocks. Now these are obviously responsible for how your car is going to handle on the track. You can change spring rates, you can change oils, you can change pistons. There's tons of stuff you can do to tune these shocks. This looks like a ton of parts. We're gonna throw these together real quick. These are the fronts. Rears are gonna go together exactly the same way. We're just gonna go with kit oils in these. So let's run through putting one together real quick. We'll bleed it, and then we'll get the other four done and throw them on our car. So shocks, lots of little parts. I like to start with all the O-rings. They're easy. They're also really easy to lose, so popping them into their place right away ensures that you aren't going to lose them. Next, I use ProTech O-ring grease in my shock cartridge. This greases up the O-rings so that everything is nice and fluid and also helps prevent leaking. So with our O-rings and our spacer and our lower cartridge cap, we can go ahead and screw that all together. Now we're gonna install the piston on our shock shaft. This is just the kit piston. There are different pistons available depending on what surface you're running on or how you want your car to handle. We always wanna Loctite this screw because if it comes loose, your shock's gonna hyperextend and fall apart. So now to install the shaft, I like to put a little shock oil on it so it's lubricated so you don't tear the O-rings or the X-rings putting it through. I also like to lube the O-ring in the preload screw. This lets it thread onto the shock body much easier. Now we can pop our ball ends into our shock eyelets with our handy shock tool, and then we can also use our shock tool to hold the shaft to screw that eyelet into place. Now we're gonna fill it with 600 CST oil, and Tekno does have a pretty involved shock bleeding process. You just wanna follow those steps in your manual and you're gonna get pretty smooth shocks. It might take a time or two of bleeding, but you wanna make sure that they're fairly dead and don't retract or push out. So now that our shock is bled, we can install our spring and our spring cup. And then this little grub screw holds our spring cup onto our lower shock eyelet so we don't lose it. Super easy. Well, that's one shock done, 3 more to go. The bleeding process on these is fairly easy, but it might take you a couple times of pumping and bleeding to get your air mixture right in the shock. These are an emulsion shock. There's no bladder up in the cap, so you actually want air in there. And when you're done bleeding, you want to be able to push the shaft all the way in and not have it rebound a whole lot. And you want to be able to pull the shaft all the way out and not have it retract. So we're trying to build as dead a shock as possible. That way we're letting the spring do all the work. Now you can build these with a little bit of rebound in them. I usually don't, but some racers might like that. It's totally up to you. So let's get our other 3 shocks knocked out real quick and then we'll throw them on our car. So now that we've got our shocks all assembled, we're gonna install them on our car and get this chassis pretty much wrapped up. When you put these shocks on, you wanna make sure that that grub screw holding the lower spring cup onto the eyelet is facing towards the outside. If it's to the inside, it can cause binding on the arm. And then there's also black and silver shock mount screws. The black ones go on the left side of the car and they are your traditional right-hand thread, so righty-tighty. And the silver ones go on the right side of the car. They are left-hand thread, so lefty-tighty. And then we can put our lock nuts up top, get our rears on, and this car is ready for electronics. Well, that was probably one of the smoothest RC builds I've ever had. Everything fit perfect on this car, and it really only took about 3 hours, maybe a little bit more with bleeding those shocks, because that does take a little bit of finesse to get them just right. But still, very quick build to get it to almost rolling status. Next up, we're going to install our electronics, so make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss out on the next episode where we dive into putting our RSX PRO, our T190 steering servo in, and our 6.5 turn Gen 4 Redline brushless motor. Drop us a like while you're here, and hopefully we'll see you next time. I'm Ty Campbell. Thanks for watching.